Started. There we go. Okay. So starting things off with our agenda, I will chat a little bit about Muskoka Conservancy first, a little update for those of you who may have not joined on a webinar or event in a while. And then we'll dive right into tracking what it is, what tools you need, what, measurements you need to measure and look for and things like that. And then we'll get into our common Muskoka mammal tracks and how to identify them. Um, I do have a sort of key and guide that I've put together, which I'll send to everyone at the end of the webinar today as well, or a little bit later today, which is sort of like a take-home item that you can print out and use at home. So I'll just go over how to use that during one of the slides as well. And then we've got a bonus, because I always need to have some sort of bonus slide. And I've called that "Whose Scat Is That?" So that should be fun as well. And then we'll have a period for questions at the end as well. So a little bit about Muskoka Conservancy. So we are a registered charity, and we're the Land Trust or Nature Conservancy of Muskoka. We've been around since 1987, so I think that's about 37 years now. And our mission is to protect and conserve the nature of Muskoka. And we do this by physically acquiring land that once it's acquired by us, it's then protected in perpetuity for all of our future generations of humans, as well as for all of the plants and animals and species at risk and important critters that, keep all of our ecosystems going. Um, so the way we acquire land is either through generous community donations of land. Sometimes communities will raise funds for us to protect land as well. And in more recent years, there's been more grants and family foundations interested in funding and supporting land conservation and land protection. So we either are acquiring land through donation or through purchase. As of 2024, we're protecting 56 different areas across the region, and this adds up to just over 4,600 acres of land, just over 64,000 feet of sensitive shoreline and riparian areas on some of our major lakes like Lake Joseph and Lake Muskoka, but a lot of our smaller lakes as well, and just over 800 acres of wetland. So lots of really important areas that we're protecting across the region. Um, some of our properties are accessible to the public with trails, like our Upjohn Nature Reserve, which we found these fisher tracks at last year. But most of them are closed to the public, and they're protected strictly for nature conservation. We do have a Nature Quest series of guided hikes, where we take people out onto some areas that aren't normally accessible to the public as well. And then I always just like to mention in this slide as well, we are a relatively small team here at Muskoka Conservancy. So I always like to give a little shout out to our volunteers and members who support a lot of the amazing work, programs and events that we do at the Conservancy. So yeah, that's a little bit about us. And now we'll jump right into tracking. So it's probably a little bit self-explanatory. You guys all probably have an understanding of what animal tracking is. But basically, it's using any type of animal sign to learn more about the animals that are out there. So you can use their prints, which is what we're going to be focusing on today, that are left behind in the snow or the mud as well. You can look for scat or droppings that are left behind. Each mammal will have a unique, different kind of scat to look for and identify. But you can even use evidence of feeding. So whether it's a deer that's browsing on some buds or some twigs, or even maybe a carcass that you find that's left behind by, a couple coyotes or things like that. So any sort of sign or evidence left behind by mammals that you can use to identify them and learn a bit more about them. So why do people track? Sort of the main reason I think why most of us probably track is because there's so many mammal species that are out there, But they're very shy and they're rarely ever seen. So many of you, just like me, have probably gone out for a hike and you're thinking, oh, hopefully I'll see, a marten or some kind of weasel up in a tree, or maybe I'll find a deer or something, something interesting out there. But generally, you just see their tracks that are left behind in the snow, or you see them in the mud. Maybe you'll see a squirrel if you're lucky. Um, so by learning how to identify tracks and trails, how to identify animals by their tracks can be something exciting to do when you're out there in the bush, but you're not really seeing any animals around you. You can still find their tracks and sort of have some fun with that instead. Um, so it's really helpful for us at the Conservancy because we do species inventories at all of our different protected areas to learn more about who's using the land that we're protecting. So it can be really helpful for us to know how to identify tracks so we can determine who is using the areas when we can't actually see them. We do have some wildlife cameras out at some of the nature reserves so we can see, what more secretive animals are around. But we don't have them at all of our nature reserves, so it can be helpful to, look at a print and say, there's the deer or moose or, whatever's using the different protected areas. Um, it can be fun because you can sort of find out a little story about an animal based off of their tracks as well. So whether they're tracks that are leading to a tree, or whether the tracks are like running and there's maybe like some rabbit tracks that are like bounding through the snow and you see some fox tracks following after them. It can be a bit exciting to sort of put a story together on what the animals are doing based off of their tracks. And it's also really helpful for folks who are hunting, to be able to track animals and find them, as well as for nature photography as well. So there's lots of reasons why you might be interested in tracking, and you might fall into a couple of those different categories. But generally, I just do it for fun, and it helps with my job as well, which is great. Um, so now some tips and tricks on what to bring with you. So it's important to bring a retractable tape measure with you. So this is better than just bringing a ruler, or maybe a set of calipers or something like that, because you do want to measure, and we'll talk about this in the next slide, the stride lengths of animals. So the distance between sets of prints, which can be quite large depending on the animal that you're looking at. So bringing a long retractable tape measure for measuring different things is really, really helpful. You'll probably also want to bring a notebook and a pencil. This can be really helpful for writing down the different measurements that you're seeing. If you're artistic, probably most of you are more artistic than I am. You can draw a little sketch of the prints that you're seeing and things like that to help you learn more, remember what you're seeing, and things like that. Everyone's got a camera on their phone. Most people do these days anyway. So bring a camera with you, bring your phone to take some photos of what you're seeing, so you can sort of review things at home and have something to refer to. Um, and it's also really helpful to bring a tracking field book or field guide, or a key and guide chart like the one I'll go over and send you guys later today, to really help you when you're out in the field, to figure out what you're looking at. Okay, now we'll get into what to measure. So I feel like already this page looks a little bit daunting. There's lots of information on here. And there is lots of different things that you should look at and measure to figure out what species of animal prints you're looking at. So starting with our paw prints, the first thing you can look for is the number of toe, palm, and heel pads. So of course, those are the paw pad prints that are left behind. So not all animals will leave behind their heel print. It doesn't register for all animals. So usually you just end up seeing the toe prints and the palm print. Another thing you'll look for when looking at prints is the presence of claws or fur. So if you have a cat at home, or you know a bit about cats, you might know that they have retractable claws. So when they're walking around, they won't actually leave behind the imprint of claws in their print. So it can be Really helpful to look for whether you can see claws or not, to tell if you're looking at a member of the cat family or the dog family, for example. For fur as well, a lot of our more northern climate animals will have very fuzzy and furry feet to help keep them warm and protected in the wintertime. So that can help you tell the difference between some species as well. You'll also want to consider the shape, so whether they're very narrow and slender prints or whether they're round. A lot of our cats will have more round, wider prints compared to the dog family. Um, and of course, you'll want to look at the size and measure the size, so the length and the width of the prints. So when you're measuring the length, you'll measure from the base of the palm or heel pad, whatever is left behind, whatever is present, all the way up to the top of the nail or claw prints if they're present as well. And for the width, you'll be measuring at the widest part of the print. So, right about here. Hopefully you guys can see my cursor moving around. And then the last thing you'll want to look for and consider when you're looking specifically at the paw prints is the register of the prints. So whether they have a direct or indirect register, so where their prints are falling on the ground. So direct register is when the hind print will fall directly in place of the front print. Whereas indirect register is when they might overlap a little bit. The hind print might fall like slightly over the front print, or they might just be directly side by side. So if you think about it a little bit, a lot of our more slender, narrow-bodied animals will have direct register because their feet are held closer together. Whereas if you think of our, wider-bodied animals like raccoon or bear, they will have more of an indirect register where their prints will fall side by side, just because they have a wider gait to them. So that's all of the information you're going to want to look for the paw prints. But it's also really important that you're not just, looking right at one single print and thinking you figured it all out, but you want to look at the trails that the animal's leaving behind as well. So you will measure the length of an animal's trail by measuring their stride length, which I've got depicted down here. So this basically tells you how long-bodied, how large an animal is by measuring their stride length. So how far apart are their sets of prints? And you'll measure their stride length either from toe to toe, or you can measure it from heel to heel as well. But I think in most of my measurements in this slide, we're measuring from toe to toe. You'll also measure the width of the stride from the outside of the left to the outside of the right print. And similar to the register, a lot of our slender-bodied, skinnier animals will have a more narrow stride width and direct register compared to our wide-bodied animals, which will have a much wider stride width and more indirect register. And then the last thing you kind of want to think about and consider is the pattern of the trail and the pattern of the prints, which basically changes depending on how fast that animal is moving, which, depends on what they're doing, whether they're just walking along or hunting, chasing after another critter, or maybe running from another critter. So basically the sort of design of their trail can change depending on their gait, whether they're trotting or walking along, loping, bounding, running, or even galloping. And so because this is a sort of intro to tracks and trails, all of the measurements that we'll look at today will just be for, a very standard casual animal who's just trotting or walking along. We won't get into all of the different patterns for if they're running or bounding, just to keep things a bit easier for you guys. So I know that's a lot of information. Any questions at this point? I'm not seeing any pop up, so that's good. Hopefully you guys aren't feeling, well, where's my mouse? Feeling too overwhelmed by all of that. I know it's a lot of different things to measure, a lot of different things to consider, but thankfully there's one really important step that makes it a little bit easier and, you know, a bit of weight is relieved when you take this first step, which is to try to identify what animal family that you're looking at when you find a set of prints. So instead of there being, you know, 20 or 30 different possible animals, narrow it down to some key characteristics that belong to a specific animal family, like the dog family or the cat family. And then that will narrow it down to fewer species. So it makes it a little bit easier to identify the critters' prints that you're looking at. So over the next couple of slides, we'll get into some specific families and some specific species and how to identify their prints. And to hopefully make it a bit fun for you guys, how I've laid it out is I've got the animal family listed in their scientific name, and I've included all of the sort of key characteristics that all members of that family will share. I'll get you guys to try and guess if you know what family it is, and then we'll get into some specific species and how to identify their prints specifically. So the first family we're looking at is the Canidae family, and these are all of the different features that they share. So all members of the Canidae family will have relatively narrow prints. They'll have direct register and a narrow trail width, which remember, that means they've got a pretty slender body to them. And their hind tracks tend to be smaller than their front tracks. Any guesses as to what this family is? Feel free to put it in the chat or unmute yourself if you'd like. The Canidae family, canine family. Any guesses? Oh, there's someone popped up in the chat. Got a couple. Beaver, not quite. Wolves. That's correct. So the wolf is a member. I don't know if you guys can see the chat. I just moved it so it's out of the way, for me anyway. But yes, this is the wolf is a member of this family, and it's the dog family. So the canine family or the dog family. Yeah, we've got some more comments coming in there now. Yeah, so our members of the canine family, the dog family, include fox, coyote, and wolf here in the Muskoka region, and they will all share these different characteristics. So the specific species that we'll cover today are the red fox and the eastern coyote. We do have wolves around the region as well. And in that field guide that I'll send you guys a copy of, I do have the information for the wolves as well. But to keep things condensed for this presentation, we've got the red fox and our eastern coyote. So looking at the red fox, one thing I'll mention first before I get into it as well. I'm a very visual learner, so I included a ruler in all of these slides with a little highlighted portion which shows the large end of the animal's print length. So this is sort of how long a fox's print could be, and this is how long a coyote's footprint could be. Just to help visualize things. I don't know, it's really helpful for me, so hopefully for some of our visual learners, that helps you see the difference as well. So for our red fox, they have very fuzzy feet, very furry feet. They're very well adapted for more northern climates. But this can also make it a bit harder to see their pads in the prints they leave behind. So sometimes they're obscured by all of their fur. They do have a bar at the base of their heel pad as well. So they sort of have like a sharp base to their heel pad. Like I mentioned, for all canines, they walk in a direct register with the hind foot falling in place of the front foot. I'm not going to go through all of the measurements because I think that's just me spewing a lot of numbers at you guys, which can be a little bit hard to retain. But like I said, I'll send you the sheets that have all of the measurements on them so you can have that at home. Um, but if you do take a peek at the measurements here, you'll see that a large fox, the length of their paw print is about the small end of a small coyote's print. So there might be a little bit of overlap between the fox print and the coyote print, but generally a fox's print, their stride length, their trail width, everything will be smaller for a fox compared to a coyote, which of course is larger than a fox. Um, but yeah, I'm not going to read through all of the numbers for you guys. When looking at the eastern coyote, it's going to be a little bit bigger, as mentioned. They have relatively narrow prints as well, but they tend to be a bit more oval shaped, so a little bit wider than a fox's print. And their heel pad is more rounded as well, so they won't have that abrupt bar that a fox has. And they also have direct register when walking and trotting. So those are our two canines that we'll cover today. On to our next family. We've got the Felidae family. They have very round prints, retractable claws, so they're not visible in prints, and a narrow trail width as well. I'll open up the chat again to see if we have any guesses for what this family is. Yes, the feline or cat family. Good job, guys. Okay, so we have three members of the cat family in Ontario, two that are found here in Muskoka, the Canada lynx and the bobcat. We also have puma, mountain lion, cougar, whatever you want to call it. I know some people may have seen them in Muskoka, but they are listed as extirpated in the province, so I'm going to say we don't have cougars around here, and I haven't included their measurements. For the sake of this presentation, we're looking just at the Canada lynx and the bobcat. So sort of the difference between the two species is, the bobcat is a lot smaller, the lynx is a lot larger, and the bobcat is a more southern species compared to the lynx, which you can see in this photo is very well adapted for cold northern climates. But right here in Muskoka, we're sort of on the edge of both of their ranges. So there is the chance that we'll see both of them here. So I wanted to include them both for you guys. Again, taking a look at the ruler measurements, you'll see that, the large end of a lynx's footprint is still significantly larger than that of a bobcat's print. They're both very round in shape. But the lynx being more well adapted for winter climates and cold climates, similar to the fox, has very furry underside of the paws, which can really obscure the prints that are left behind compared to the bobcat, which will be more well defined. But yeah, they have very narrow trail width as well, and direct register as well. If you did find a really large cat print, then it might belong to the puma or cougar. But I'm going to say you won't find those around here. So our next family that we'll look at is the Mustelidae family. They have small and furry prints. They have a bounding pattern to their strides, which is called a tutu pattern, where both their prints appear side by side as they're bounding. And they have a very narrow trail width as well. Any guesses for what the Mustelidae family is? Weasels, that's right. Great job, guys. So the weasel family includes quite a few different species in our area. So it includes the ermine, the long and short-tailed weasels, mink, marten, fisher, skunk belongs to that family as well, and otters as well. So tons of different critters that belong to the weasel family. And there is, unfortunately, a lot of overlap to their measurements as well. So this is
Uh,
probably the hardest family to try and differentiate and identify the different prints of. Um, so if you are trying to, if you find a set of weasel prints and you want to identify them, you're going to have to take tons of different measurements and sort of average them all out and try and figure it out. So I don't want to scare you off from it. You can try to do it, but it is pretty difficult. Um, so for the sake of the presentation, I've just included one of our weasel family members, the American mink, um, and some other information here. So like I mentioned, they have small furry paws that can be hard to identify and measure in the snow. But if you do find them and you're able to measure them, for the mink, it's about 1 1/4 inch to 2 inch long and 1 1/4 inch to 1 3/4 inches wide. So as you can see, they're quite round and evenly distributed. So about the same length as they tend to, as same length and width is what they tend to have. So very symmetrical. That's the word I was looking for. So that 2 to 2 pattern you can see here as well, where their prints will appear side by side as they're bounding through the snow. Um, yeah, and that's pretty much it for our Mustelidae or our weasel families. Relatively small, pretty hard to identify. It can be a bit more distinct for some of the different species. So if you think of an otter, they're going to be a bit larger than our mink and some of our smaller weasels. And some of you might have seen their prints before, but they tend to do belly slides if the conditions are right when they're sort of bounding through the snow. So that's something you can look for if you're looking for weasel prints or otter prints. My bad, sorry. Okay. Our next family is the ungulate family or the ungulata family. These are our only animals that have hooves with 4 toes, 2 crescent-shaped and 2 dew claws, which you don't always see registering in their prints. Um, they might have direct register or indirect register, depending on conditions. And they tend to have a narrow trail width as well. Any guesses for these guys? Yes, we've already got some comments in there. Our deer family. And we've got 2 animals that belong to this family, our white-tailed deer and our moose. So these guys are pretty easy to identify. Like I mentioned, the 4 toes and dew claws present are very, very distinct. They're the only critters you'll find with this type of print. And it's pretty easy to tell the difference between deer prints and moose prints because of their size. Um, so our deer, white-tailed deer, are about 100 to 300 pounds compared to our moose, which are about 1,400 pounds. So the sizes are very, very different and easy to tell apart. As you can see with the rulers here, the moose print is generally going to be about double the length of a white-tailed deer's print. Um, and same with their stride length as well. It's going to be a lot larger as well. Our deer and our moose. Next is the Rodentia family, which is, I think, pretty easy to figure out. I did include a lot of shared characteristics for this family because there is a lot of variability and a lot of differences between the different species that are found in the Rodentia family. So, any ideas what sort of common term for Rodentia is? Our rodents, yes, exactly. So this could include our squirrels, mice, porcupine, beavers, lots of different variability in the rodent family. Okay. So for our presentation, We're going to go over two of the different members of the family. Everyone's favorite, the eastern gray squirrel. Here we've got the black version of the eastern gray squirrel. And one of my favorites, the porcupine, because they're quite cute. Um, Rodent prints, especially our eastern gray squirrel, can be pretty easy to identify, especially if you get a nice set of prints like the ones found here, because you can see all of their different little toe pads, which look like little hand prints almost left behind. So our squirrels will have four toes, which are quite elongated, with nails present as well. And they have three large palm pads and two heel pads, which, in wet snow sort of all blend together, but sometimes you can pick them all out. They do have quite a big difference between their hind feet and their front feet. So their hind feet are a lot larger, with very elongated toes and nails. And compared to their front feet, which are a lot smaller. They have a bounding pattern most of the time if you see them running around. Um, and it's quite unique in the fact that when they're bounding and their prints are left behind, their hind feet or their back feet are always found in front of their front feet. So I've marked it with F and H here, where their front feet are very small with their hind feet in the front. They have quite variable stride length, as you can tell. If they're just hopping along, only 6 inches, compared to if they're really running at full speed, could be up to 30 inches for their stride length, which is pretty crazy to think of a squirrel jumping that far, but we've probably all seen them do it. Now looking at our porcupine, they have very unique prints, if you're able to find them. Their palm and heel pads are actually merged together, which you can sort of see in the display here. And they're actually pebbled as well. So they're all textured, which really helps them for climbing trees, where you often see them eating bark and twigs and things like that. They have very, very long nails, which also helps them climb trees. And they actually have a gap between the nails and their toe pads, which you'll be able to see in the prints they leave behind. Being a very rotund animal and very wide-bodied, these are one of our creatures that will have an indirect register where you'll see the front and hind feet next to each other with no overlap. And they will have a tail drag present as well. So that's another key thing to look for the porcupine. Our beaver will also have a tail drag present as well, which can sometimes obscure the prints that are left behind as well. So those are our rodents, but there's lots of different critters that belong to this family that you can look into as well. And now the last couple prints that we'll look at are families that really only have one species present here in Muskoka. So there wasn't really a group that I could put together for them. So we've got the Procyonidae family, which is our raccoon family. Raccoon's the only member of this family anywhere in the world. We've got the Ursidae family, which is our bear family. And of course, we only have black bears present around here. And then our Leporidae family, or our rabbit family. So we'll be looking at the snowshoe hare. Excuse me. Okay. So starting with the snowshoe hare here, similar to our squirrels with their bounding pattern, you will find their hind feet present ahead of their front feet, which are much smaller. So they've got very big feet for bounding through the snow. So one of the differences that you'll want to look at to sort of figure out if you're looking at squirrel prints or rabbit prints is that with our squirrels, which you hopefully noticed in the last slide because I forgot to point it out, is their front feet will always be side by side. Whereas with our hares and our rabbits, their front feet will sort of be staggered when they're running. So that's a key thing to look for if you want to figure out if you're looking at a really big squirrel's print or a small rabbit print. Um, their hind feet are a lot larger, which is represented in the ruler here. So with these sort of unique characteristics, it's pretty easy to identify their prints when you see them out in the field. Our raccoons are quite unique as well, of course, very human-like prints that they leave behind. So they have very elongated toe prints, and usually you can see some of the nail prints present as well. Generally, you'll see their tracks with the front and rear tracks side by side. Again, one of our larger bodied animals that tend to waddle a bit more. So you'll see their front and hind prints next to each other with their very, very big human-like fingers and palms. And lastly, our black bear, which you can see almost runs out the entire length of the ruler here. Some of the largest prints you'll see belong to the black bear. You will see their 5 toe prints present with a large palm and heel pad, which tends to sort of blend together as well. And you'll see, of course, those big, long nails present in their prints as well. They will have a very wide trail width as well, being one of our large-bodied animals, and pretty long stride length as well. Okay, so those are all of the specific critters that I'm covering for the presentation. Do not fret that I didn't go through all of the specific measurements. And don't worry if you didn't take a photo of them or anything, because we've got our fantastic key to mammal tracks and the corresponding guide chart. So you'll start off with the key to mammal tracks here on the left side of the screen. And it's just like a flow chart. So you'll go through and answer all of the different questions until you get to one of these colored answers, basically. And then once you've landed to one of these, so for example, you're looking at, let's say, some moose prints. You'll start at the start. You'll ask yourself, are they hooves or do they have paw pads present? I've made this one really easy. They're hooves. So you'll go over here to the deer family, which is represented in this sort of lighter orange color. So great, you got narrowed things down to the deer family. Move over to the guide chart and look at the light orange color. You'll see your 2 options are the white-tailed deer or the moose. And here's where you're going to start taking your measurements to look at the print size, the stride length from toe to toe, and the trail width. And we've got some other notes present as well, which are some of the things that I've gone through in the presentation today to help narrow things down and figure out what species you're looking at. And we've got each of those families on here, all color coordinated. I'll send this to you guys, and hopefully you'll have some fun using this in your back 40 or some of your local trails. Any questions about how to use the key and guide? I think it's relatively straightforward. Let's see. Okay, great. Okay. So now we're to our bonus section. Very fun. Whose scat is that? Plus browse and other signs. So it's not just all scat that I'll show you guys here. But here is our first one. So we've got some scat present here. And here's another sign that this species might leave behind as well. Any guesses? Let me open the chat here. Who do you think left this behind? Awesome. We've got some people suggesting deer, white-tailed deer. That's right. So they've got this nice pebbled scat that they'll leave behind, which is unique to our ungulate family. Looks a little bit like chocolate, but don't test that theory out. And then this sign here is actually an antler rub. So when they're getting time to their sort of velvet is coming off their antlers, they'll sort of rub them on trees, and it can be a way to sort of mark their territory as well. White-tailed deer. Okay, here's our next one here. So this is some feeding browse on a tree. You can sort of see the tooth prints left behind. Any guesses for what animal might have been feeding on this tree? I'll mention that it was probably 4 feet in the from the ground, probably. Any guesses? Someone guessed moose. No, not quite, but good guess. This one is a little tricky. Okay, I'll tell you guys. It's porcupine. So you can sort of see the little tooth marks left behind. So if you think of our rodents, they've got those really sharp incisors for chewing on wood and eating bark and things like that. So this is from a porcupine eating on some bark. Here's some more scat for you guys. Notice the presence of hair and fur in the scat here. Any guesses? Coyote, that's right. So coyote scat and wolf scat will look pretty similar. Just sort of depends on the size of it and what sort of region you're in, depending on if you're in the territory or range of wolves or coyotes. But of course, being predators, they can't digest the hair that they're consuming. So you'll see that in the scat that's left behind. And then we've got one last one here for you guys. Any guesses on this scat? It's from the same species, but sort of at different times of the year. So at certain times of the year, this animal will be eating more berries, and other times of the year, they'll be eating more meat materials. Black bear. Yes, that's right. Great job. Good job for whose scat is that? Okay. So, excuse me, that brings us to the end of our presentation. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I've also included my information on here. So if you ever have any questions or you have photos of tracks or trails that you want to send me, feel free to. I'm always happy to connect with you guys. And yeah, I'll send out those resources and a copy of the presentation later today, if there's no questions. Or feel free to unmute yourself as well if you have any questions. Thanks, Kim. Glad you enjoyed it. Okay. Looks like there's no questions. We'll see you guys in the new year then. Happy holidays and Merry Christmas.
Thanks very much.
Take care, everyone.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.